the format of the meeting, we have every Monday we pick a topic and we have a speaker come and speak to that topic. Tonight, the topic is emotional sobriety. I'll introduce our speaker momentarily. And this will be part of a two workshop series tonight, and on the same time, same Zoom on Monday, March the 8th. Well, everybody is welcome. And we're so happy that you're all here. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. I heard this gentleman give a talk online, and I was so impressed. And I love this topic, emotional sobriety. And I won't go into too much detail except to introduce our speaker tonight, Alan.
Okay, well, thank you, Patrick, for the invitation to come and to share with you the work I've been doing on emotional sobriety, and it's been so meaningful for me. And before I go into the workshop part of it, I just want to tell you about my own personal journey. So my journey in recovery started back in 1971. That seems like such a long time ago now. God, 71. I was just coming back from Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I was in the Marine Corps. I went in the Marine Corps as a geographical solution to the problems I was having at home that were caused by being a teenage alcoholic. I joined the Marine Corps when I was 17. I was in Vietnam at 18 years old. Combat veteran. Went in the Marine Corps an alcoholic, came back from Vietnam an alcoholic and an addict. And through today, what either was synchronicity or serendipity, I ended up being the third Marine admitted into a special program that they developed to rehabilitate Marines that were coming back from Vietnam with drug problems. It was called the Drug Exemption Program. So we were exempted from prosecution under the Code of Military Justice. And instead of thrown out of the Marine Corps, thrown into the brig, we were put in rehabilitation. And I was the third Marine admitted on the third day that the program was in existence. So they had no idea what they were doing. It was so brand new, but they knew they didn't know. And I was at that time stationed. This was my last duty station at the Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. And it just so happened outside of the Marine Corps base in Kailua was a strong group of young people that were following this way of life. They had been brought into the program with a woman by the name of Flo, and she was like the Pied Piper of young people back then. She had a commune on the North Shore with about 20 young people that were, following the 12 steps and addressing their own problems with alcohol and other drugs. And so the non-commissioned officer who was in charge of our program, Gunnery Sergeant Jerry Jones, he invited one of the young people that was in this group in Kailua, they were called Flobird's Birds, to come in and share his story. So this was on a Tuesday night, and I'll take you back to Kaneohe with me on that Tuesday night. So if you can picture this, there was about 20 of us Marines in our combat fatigues, and in walks this hippie, and his name is Tom. He doesn't mind me sharing his last name, Tom McCall, and he's got his hair in a ponytail, and he's in Hawaii, so he's got his Hawaiian print shirt on, he's got his shorts on, and I think the standard issue Birkenstock sandals when he walks in. And here are a bunch of combat veterans from Vietnam looking at this guy that was probably protesting the war. So you can imagine that in that room, juxtaposed to Tom and the 20 of us, there was this weird energy in the beginning. We were quite skeptical that this guy had anything to say to us. Well, that was going to change substantially after he started to talk. That night was the beginning of an unbelievable change in my life. What I experienced, and I'm certain a lot of you have experienced this as well, it was the first time that I heard someone do this, what we call true speaking in the program. The authenticity that Tom brought to us and his willingness to share things that I felt and that I experienced, but I thought I would never let anybody know about any of these things. And see, now when I look back at what happened, is Tom had emotional freedom. He was free from himself. He wasn't hung up with all of the shoulds and supposed tos and other things that prevented him from being himself. And he was willing to share that with us with no expectation that we had to appreciate it, find value in it, or anything else. He was just there to talk about what his experience was. That blew my mind. You see, the only time that I achieved that kind of an emotional freedom was when I was either drunk or high. Then I didn't care what was going on with me. Then I didn't care what was happening. And I really, truly believe today that I drank and used to achieve that state of freedom. And here was someone who was with us and being able to be free without being high. I was blown away. It was like, oh my God, that's possible? Like I had never imagined that could be a possibility in life. In fact, today I define recovery as the discovery of new possibilities. And I was discovering one of those new possibilities that Tuesday night at the Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station. I say this a lot. I think a lot of us start this program because we're afraid, right? We're in pain. We're afraid of what's going to happen if we keep going down the path. And that kind of motivation is powerful. They call it a deficit motivation. It's a motivation out of pain, and that'll get you going. But the problem with that motivation is once the pain stops, then the motivation starts to be diffused. The other motivation is a motivation that's based on growth and excitement and passion. And that night, I got excited about a new possibility in life. When you're motivated by that kind of motivation, you're here forever. I mean, it continues to be a journey of what can I learn today? What's the new challenge that's going to come my way? And how can I meet that challenge and digest it in a way that's going to grow me? And that's what woke up inside of me, that desire to be what I can be. So that started my journey. This last summer, I celebrated 49 years in the program. So I've been here for quite a number of time, quite a long time. And it's been an amazing journey. I'm not going to go into it tonight because that's not what the purpose of this is. I just wanted to share with you how I came to this program. So first thing that happened to me is I got excited about recovery, got turned on to recovery, just like I got turned on to drugs and alcohol. I got turned on to recovery. I loved it. I loved what was going on. I went up to Tom, how do I create that in my life? And he said, just stick close. And I did. Tom is still my sponsor today after 49 years. Unbelievable relationship that has developed between us. I can't begin to explain what he means to me and the depth of our relationship, but it's phenomenal. He's going through a tough time right now. He just lost his wife to lung cancer. And so he's grieving quite a lot, but it's that thing in recovery, she passed away. And after the paramedics left, I'll probably cry when I say this, he got to lay on the floor with her and tell her how much she meant to him and what it was like, and had to really had an incredible closure with her. Quite touching when he shared that with me. So that's part of what's going on in this program. I got excited about recovery. I had about 60 days clean and sober. The program was new. They didn't have any counselors, and they invited me to come on board to be a counselor. I go, oh, God, that was better than pushing a 105 howitzer around. So I, was very excited to become on board the staff, and I got turned on to helping people. And that was also in 71. And then I said, I'd love to do this. I'd love to go back to school and become a clinical psychologist. And I did. And it was a daunting enterprise, given the fact I'm a high school dropout. literally no high school. So I started college in 71, and my first class was oceanography in Hawaii. Great place to take oceanography, and fell in love with learning and education. And 16 years later, in 1987, I graduated with a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of California, Davis. So it's been an unbelievable journey, you know. And every time I had an opportunity to do a presentation or to write a paper in school, I really focused on change and the power of change and what creates change and what are the therapeutic values of the steps and all of those kinds of things. And that's, you know, ended up really defining my whole career. And what I want to do now is take off my Alan Berger in recovery hat, and I want to put on my Dr. Berger hat for a minute and start to talk to you about emotional sobriety. So let me pull up these slides that I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And we're going to go on a little journey of emotional sobriety. Okay, so guys can see that and hear me fine, right? Is that right, Patrick? We okay?
I certainly can, yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about emotional sobriety, the next frontier. And it's such an important topic. And as you're going to see, that really the purpose of working the steps is for us to be able to experience this kind of emotional freedom in life. It is the purpose. It is the purpose of working the steps. And today we're going to dig into an introduction to emotional sobriety, and I'll expand on that in the workshop in 2 weeks, and maybe down the road we'll even go through some of the steps, Patrick, and talk about how they achieve emotional sobriety. But let's go ahead and dig into this. But I think it's important to think of recovery in stages. And this was the work of Ernie Larson. And if you haven't been exposed to Ernie Larson and his writings, do yourself a favor and get a couple of his books. I would recommend Stage 2 Recovery to begin with. But Ernie thought of recovery in stages, and so did Bill Wilson. And in Stage 1 recovery, he described it as breaking the bonds of our primary addiction. So it's very important is that in order to do the work that's going to be necessary for us to do to grow ourselves in the way we need to grow ourselves, we got to get that plug in the jug. And there's a lot of good reasons for it, but one of the most important things is the way that the drugs change our cognitive abilities. You know, we have what's called a most of the time a reversible, brain damage as a result of our drinking and using. I mean, studies have shown is that we gain almost a full standard deviation of our intellectual function in the first year of our abstinence. So it's so important to be able to get clear-headed, right? And so we can develop some straight thinking. But what Ernie says, and he's so right on when he says this, he says abstinence may get you out of a bad place, but getting out of a bad place just gets you out. It's not the same as getting into a good place. Now, we got to remember that more work needs to be done, although that's very important. That's where Stage 2 recovery comes along. He published this book in 1985, and here's how he defines Stage 2 recovery. Stage 2 recovery gets at the underlying patterns and habits that caused us trouble in the first place. See, my drinking and using was a solution in life. It was a solution to not knowing how to be okay. And I had to rely on alcohol and other drugs to be okay. And so when he talks about these patterns and habits that caused us trouble in the first place, today I hope to reveal to you what those patterns and habits are that cause us trouble. We're going to get into that when we dig into Bill's letter. And he goes on to say, well, if nothing changes, which means if we don't change, then nothing changes. He says the same results will pop up through our whole life. And this is the problem that so many of us have in recovery. We get clean and sober, but we still don't know how to deal with life. We still haven't matured. And so we run into trouble And then what happens is we don't know how to meet it in a good way. And what do? We go back to drinking again or using. It's caused so many relapses in recovery. So he goes on to say that this stage 2 recovery is about learning how to make relationships work is at the core of recovery. I like to say it's learning how to deal with life on life's terms. That's at the core of full recovery, is learning how to show up in our lives. So we know this, that recovery is and demands change. Recovery means that things have to be different than they are, that I have to be different than I was. And today we're going to talk about how we need to be different. That's what the emotional sobriety is all about. And as you're going to see, the stage 2 recovery is really contingent on emotional sobriety. You cannot enjoy stage 2 recovery without emotional sobriety. So today we're going to dig into part 1 of this, which means we're going to go through an exploration of this letter that Bill wrote in 1956. Now, this letter was written to a gentleman in California who was depressed. And he wrote to the General Service Office and said, look, I've been struggling with depression. I'm a member of the fellowship, and I'm trying to use the 12 steps to deal with my depression. And does anybody have some ideas on how I might be able to do that? I imagine when Bill saw that letter, he got quite excited because Bill was depressed his whole life. And he had been working on that and diligently working on that in his recovery. He got some incredible spiritual direction from some great spiritual leaders in our country. He was also in a very intimate relationship with Dr. Harry Tiebout, a psychoanalyst who was in Connecticut. And I call their relationship informal therapy. I think it meant the world to Harry. And Bill Wilson was also exposed to the work of all kinds of great psychotherapists at that time, Adler, Dr. Karen Horney. So you can see as we go through this letter and we unpack it that it's so psychologically minded, which to me is so exciting. I'd give Bill an honorary Ph.D. for what he did in this letter. Now, this letter ended up being published in the 1958 Grapevine under the title Emotional Sobriety, The Next Frontier. So what I'm going to do is go through this letter. I'm going to break it down into segments, and we're going to discuss each segment. And then we'll leave about 20 minutes or so at the end, hopefully for a discussion. I'm just looking around for my phone so I can keep track of the time. There it is. Okay. All right. So here we go.
I think many oldsters who have put our booze cure to severe but successful tests still find that they often lack emotional sobriety. Perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, the development of much more real maturity and balance, which is to say, humility, in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God.
Well, this was the second place that I could find the term emotional sobriety in the literature. The first place is in the 12 and 12. And it's weird. I used to say that this was the first place that I think Bill used the term or the phrase, and it was not. In the 12 and 12, when he's describing step 12, at the end of the second paragraph, and I'm paraphrasing it, he has a statement that goes like this. If we practice these steps, these principles in our daily affairs, that we and those about us begin to achieve emotional sobriety. So Bill clearly stated in the 12 and 12 that the goal of our recovery, the goal of working the 12 steps, the purpose of working them is the achievement of emotional sobriety. Now, I can't tell you, I've been around the program for almost 5 decades now. I have never heard that stated in a meeting. In all the meetings I've attended, I've never heard anybody say that the purpose of working this program is not only to achieve physical sobriety, which is important, but emotional sobriety. That's what full recovery looks like. Now, Bill hoped that this would be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, Now, this was back in 1956, published in 58, and it did not become the spearhead for the next major development. I have some thoughts about that, and I'll be sharing them in a minute in terms of what happened. How come this didn't take hold? Because when you hear this today, I hope you're going to get as excited as I am about it, because I think it's the missing link. It's the missing piece of the puzzle that we need to bring more into the mainstream of our recovery. So he goes on to define it now. He says, emotional sobriety is the development of much more real maturity and balance. Then he says, which is to say humility in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God, and God of our understanding, of course. So what do we mean by real maturity? Well, we're going to be digging into that. And essentially what maturity is, it's the transcendence of environmental support to self-support. So that sounds very technical, I'm sure, but let me try to break it down real quick. And I'm not going to elaborate too much on it, but I just want you to get a sense of it. Obviously, when we're born, we're incredibly dependent on our parents for our life, right? We have some incredible abilities as infants, but we need somebody to pick us up and move us around. We need somebody to help us get food. Now, once we get the food, our job is to, if we're a child that's being breastfed, is to learn how to suckle, right? And to be able to latch onto the mom and stuff like that. And all of that, we participate in that, but we're incredibly dependent. And what happens from early on in our life, we start out by being fused with mom inside, everything being given to us and taken care of in the womb, to now coming out in the world, and our first experience of supporting ourselves is learning how to breathe. We have to inhale and we have to exhale. Sometimes we need a little slap on the butt to get going. Well, that's not only in infancy. Sometimes we need a slap in the butt later on in our lives too, don't we? So here we are, though. The first thing that we do when we come out is we start supporting ourselves. We support ourselves through our breath, through breathing. And that development goes on and on. Physically, we go from being needed to be carried around, being laid on our tummies. We start to learn to flip to our backs, from our back to our tummy. Pretty soon we get up on all fours. We start to develop muscles and coordination to crawl, crawling moves to standing. And then eventually we start taking some of the first steps. Not one parent has to say to the child, it's time to start crawling. It's time to start walking. If we did that, none of us would be walking it now if we had parents telling us to do it. You wanted to do it. You wanted to be what you could be. That desire is built in each and every one of us. It's a part of who we are, is to move us towards what's possible, to move us towards being able to realize our potential. And it's an amazing force that exists within us. I think that's a God-given force. That's how God's in us, is that this incredible, power that moves us, that grows us in that direction. Now, I say this to people all the time. How many times do you think you fell as you learned how to walk? Well, as many as you needed to. And if you had any of these nonsense ideas that we develop in our life about how we should be and how we should act and what we should be able to do, we would all come up with, well, I'll go ahead and give myself 30 times to walk. And if I don't do it, then forget it. I'm going to give up. Well, come on now. You fell as many times as you needed to fall until you figured out how to walk and how to keep your body up and deal with gravity and all of that stuff. That's what maturity is about. Physical maturity unfolds this way. Psychological, emotional maturity, we need a lot of coaching for. We need help in terms of developing those skills. Our parents did the best they could. It's never enough. So what do we talk about? That we all end up as adults and we're still emotionally incredibly immature. You hear the phrases king baby, queen baby to describe us, because we don't know how to deal with our feelings. We don't know how to stand on our own 2 feet. we don't really know how to take care of ourselves. And that's what Bill's getting to when he talks about this real maturity and balance in our life, which is, say, humility, is just facing that we don't know how to do a lot of these things, and we need to open ourselves up to learning. So let me talk a little bit about what's happened. Why didn't this become the spearhead of the next major development in the program? Well, I think that there's a tendency in recovery for us to use spiritual bypassing to cope with our personal issues rather than walking through the hell gates of suffering. That's the word that didn't get on there, the hell gates of suffering. Well, what is spiritual bypassing? Well, it was really defined by this psychiatrist, John Wellwood, and this is how he described it. He says there is a tendency to use spiritual practice to try to rise above our emotional and personal issues. All those messy, unresolved matters that weigh us down. He says, I call this tendency to avoid or prematurely transcend basic human needs, feelings, and developmental tasks as spiritual bypassing. Now, where that's relevant today is I hope you guys listened to that set-aside prayer when we started, because this part of recovery is going to mean facing ourselves and getting real honest with ourselves. Now, there's good news. I think only the best in us can see the worst in us. And I'll say that again. I think only the best in us can see the worst in us. But we have to be willing to be uncomfortable if we're going to become more comfortable. We have to be willing to move into these areas where we're ignorant and to own our ignorance and face our ignorance if we're going to develop some new ideas, some new skills, if we're going to get some new knowledge. And so let's look at what the definition of humility is. And I think that this is important. This is from the American Psychological Association's Dictionary of Psychology. It's the second edition that was published in 2015. And this is humility. Humility is the quality of being humble. It's characterized by a low focus on the self and an accurate, not over or underestimated sense of one's accomplishments and worth. And this is key here, and an acknowledgement of one's limitations, imperfections, mistakes, gaps in knowledge, and so on. This is what makes humility so important in our recovery. Without that, we're not teachable. Without being to own that we don't know what we don't know, without being able to see that the consciousness that created our problem cannot solve it, we are not going to be open-minded enough to see some new things that might help us discover some new possibilities.
Those adolescent urges that so many of us have for top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance, urges quite appropriate to age 17, prove to be an impossible way of life when we are at age 47 or 57.
Well, Bill is now starting to give us some idea of what the problem is. What is top approval? We want everyone to like us. Perfect security, that we're going to just feel okay all the time. Perfect romance, that, boy, our partner will do what we want them to do every time we want them to do it. Those are the incredible, what creates this impossible way of life. These ideas that life has to be a certain way for us to be okay. See, that's the setup for us. That we have these ideas that life has to be a certain way for us to be okay. If everybody likes us, I'll be fine. If I just feel good all the time, then life is going to work. If my relationship is just great, we don't have any conflict, we're always in sync with each other, then I'll be okay. So we have these expectations about how things are supposed to be. Bill called that an impossible way of life. That I don't even think they're appropriate, to tell you the truth. This is one of the only areas I disagree with Bill at age 17. I think it shows us what the problem is, even that early on in our life, that we had these kinds of ideas, that these absolutes, if you will.
Since AA began, I've taken immense wallops in all those areas because of my failure to grow up, emotionally and spiritually. My God, how painful it is to keep demanding the impossible, and how very painful to discover finally that all along we had the cart before the horse. Then comes the final agony of seeing how awfully wrong we have been, but still finding ourselves unable to get off the emotional merry-go-round.
Okay, remember what Ernie Larson said about stage 2 recovery is by identifying those patterns and habits, right? So pay attention to that as we go through Bill's letter. What were the patterns and habits that he identified that were causing trouble in his life? So here he owns it. Bill gets criticized for a lot of things, but I love how honest he was. His failure to grow up emotionally and spiritually. If each one of us are honest with ourselves, we are going to see that we haven't grown up either. That we have no idea most of the time how to grow up and what that looks like. But we keep demanding the impossible, meaning that we keep trying to apply those ideas we had that caused us problems in the first place, thinking that somehow now that I'm sober, things are going to be different, and they're not. He says we had the cart before the horse. What does that mean? Well, when I expect that life has to be a certain way for me to be okay, I've put the cart before the horse. Because then I focus on trying to control what happens around me. I try to control those people and circumstances surrounding me to be okay. And if my energy is going to control you to get you to do what I think I need you to do to be okay, what we say is where you focus is where your energy goes. My energy is certainly not growing to grow me up and for me to learn how to deal with what's going on. Instead, I learn how to try to manipulate those situations around me. And I become a damn good manipulator. You know, what is the term they use to describe us? Our ability to talk somebody that there is sitting on a black couch, convincing them that it's white. It's called gaslighting. We become that good at manipulating other people to see things the way we want them to see things. Now, what Bill is saying and what happens at some point in our recovery, we start to see how, quote, awfully wrong we've been, but we don't know how to get off this emotional merry-go-round. You know, what I've heard the term by Fred Holmquist, he calls it sober suffering. We're sober now and our relationships are still not working. We're still having conflict. We still don't know how to deal with our disappointments. We still don't know how to deal with when things don't go our way. And that's what he means, that we see that we've got problems in these areas, but we don't know how to get off the emotional merry-go-round. Emotional sobriety is your ticket to get off the emotional merry-go-round. That's how we get off.
How to translate a right mental conviction into a right emotional result, and so into easy, happy, and good living. Well, that's not only the neurotic's problem, it's the problem of life itself for all of us who have got to the point of real willingness to hew to right principles in all of our affairs.
So this is so important because, see, recovery can't just be an intellectual exercise. It's important that we get some of these concepts up here, that we learn some of these ideas and stuff like that, but they have to be integrated emotionally. Meaning recovery has to be an experience, a new experience of dealing with problems in a different way, of plugging in some of the things we're going to be talking about today and learning how to identify your emotional dependence and learning how to unhook people from your expectations and instead learning how to deal with what's going on without having to change people around you or circumstances. That's what this is about, but it's going to take practice. We're going to need to go out and try some of these things on.
Even then, as we hew away, peace and joy may still elude us. That's the place so many AA oldsters have come to. And it's a hell of a spot, literally. How shall our unconscious, from which so many of our fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream, be brought into line with what we actually believe, know, and want? How to convince our dumb, raging, and hidden Mr. Hyde becomes our main task.
So now you can start to see some of the results of the work that Bill did in terms of looking at himself. And I think as a result of his relationship with Dr. Thibault and some of the other psychologists of the time that he had been reading and digesting the information, he talks about that how shall our unconscious, he first of all identifies there's something going on in our unconscious. Freud had a great way of saying this. He says that we are being lived by the forces within us, right? We are being lived by these forces within us. And that's what Bill realized. There were certain forces within us. Well, what were those forces? Well, he identified his fears. What were his fears? Well, that he wasn't going to be loved, that he wasn't going to be accepted, that he wasn't going to belong. We all want that. And of course we do. You know, relationships are very important. Belonging is very important. And, you can go into meetings and just hear how, many of us have suffered from feeling like we didn't belong until we come to these rooms. And then we're home, right? We finally found a place where we belong. Now, he says that what happens is fear of not being loved and accepted and not belonging generates now a lot of activity to deal with it. So he calls these things the compulsions and phony aspirations. Well, it means that if I can be who I think I should be, if I can be this idealized self, then I'm going to be okay. Then everybody's going to love me. Then you're going to accept me. Then I'm going to belong. Now, that idealized self is different for different people. Some of us idealize ourselves. God, if I'm just the best at everything I do, then everybody's going to love me. Other people say, well, if I can just, love someone else, give them everything they want. We call that the appeal of love. Then I'm going to be okay if I can be with that person and I can love in that way. Or the other person says, if I just let go of all these ideas and stuff like that and I just resign, then I'll be okay. But we take different paths in terms of this. But these compulsions and phony aspirations are based on this idea that if I'm someone other than I am, I'll be okay. We're never going to be okay by being somebody other than we are. The path to being okay is by facing ourselves and accepting ourselves and dealing with who we are. He goes, so how can all these things that are going on in our unconscious be brought into line with what we actually believe or be brought into line with reality? How can they be brought into line with really what we know and want, which means at a deeper level that we want to be connected, but we also want to be free. You see, we're always balancing two forces within us: the desire to join, to be a part of, for togetherness, but also to embrace your individuality, your separateness. How can we learn to do that? Well, none of us really have. He says, well, how to convince our dumb and raging hidden Mr. Hyde that hidden Mr. Hyde is just that false self becomes our main task. How do we deal with this part of us that thinks we have to be someone other than we are and that we have to control everything around us and that life has to be what we think it has to be for us to be okay? That's what we have to deal with to get to emotional sobriety.
I've recently come to believe that this can be achieved. I believe so because I begin to see many benighted ones, folks like you and me, commencing to get results. Last autumn, depression, having no really rational cause at all, almost took me to the cleaners. I began to be scared that I was in for another long chronic spell. Considering the grief I've had with depressions, it wasn't a bright prospect. I kept asking myself, Why can't the 12 steps work to release depression? By the hour, I stared at the St. Francis prayer. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. Here was the formula, all right. But why didn't it work?
So put a bookmark here and make sure I come back and talk about this later on.
Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these
Was there
things
something you
according to
wanted,
my perfectionist
from
dreams
me
and
to do, Alan?
specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression.
I'm sorry, Patrick, I couldn't hear you.
Oh yeah, was there something you wanted me to do?
No, I
Amends?
just said on that other slide, I just want everybody to bring me back if I don't talk about that. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. So let me
Okay.
just start.
Okay.
Let me just start this slide over again.
Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression.
So here was Bill's insight, and this is very important because now he knew what the matter was. He identified this as his basic flaw. He called it dependence. We're going to call it emotional dependency. And he even uses that phrase later on. He says almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. So once again, think about this in terms of environmental support. His self-esteem was what we call other validated self-esteem. It was dependent on how people treated him. It wasn't dependent on what Bill did. It was dependent on circumstances that were external, that were not within him, that were around him. He looked at people to supply him with prestige, emotional validation, right, or self-esteem, security, emotional feeling safe. His feeling of safety and well-being was dependent on what other people did and everything else. And when things didn't happen that way, according to his, what he called perfectionist dreams and specifications, which meant his demands, these were his demands on how things were, he fought for them. So when things went wrong, there's three ways we can respond to it. We try to control other people or we rebel against them. We call that moving against people. We either then turn it on ourselves and we say, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I upset you. I'm sorry I bothered you. We turn it on ourselves. We move towards other people and try to please them. Or we run away and say, forget it. This is a toxic relationship. I can't deal with it. All three of those things are reactions to our emotional dependency. And none of them help us grow up because all of them say that the problem is over there. And the problem isn't over there. The problem is with us. We have this basic flaw. This is our job to figure this out. What Bill fought for them, and when it didn't work, when he couldn't manipulate people to do what he wanted, then what happened is he felt defeated. I would say he was deflated. And when he got deflated, he ended up depressed. And if Bill wasn't in recovery, what does self-pity? Self-pity is a close friend with John Barleycorn. Before you know it, he's drinking again. That's what he discovered was wrong. That his dependence on circumstances and people for him to be okay was at the heart of the problem for him. That was his basic flaw. So emotional dependency is the result of a developmental delay. We talk about it all the time, that we are arrested in our development. We never mature beyond environment support to self-support. And that's what we talk about. AA, recovery, is a people growing experience. It grows us like nothing in our life can grow us. We still, as far as we've come in terms of psychology, AA is still the gold standard in terms of recovery. Nothing has been effective. And I think because Bill was just given this incredible gift, this incredible insight into what we needed to do to grow ourselves up. So we get stuck. And I think we get stuck at that I'm okay if level. I'm okay if Susie Valinsky liked me in the 3rd grade. I had such a crush on Susie Valinsky. I wanted her to like me so bad. I wanted her to give me a kiss at lunch so bad, so many times. And if Susie didn't do that, then I felt somehow that I wasn't okay. And we never learned to get to the point where I'm okay even if Susie Valinsky doesn't kiss me at lunchtime. I'm okay if I get that job. I'm okay if things go the way I want them to go. I'm okay if. And emotional sobriety is about I'm okay even if. That's the important thing here. The way that Fritz Perls said it, this is the founder of Gestalt therapy, goes, our dependency, our emotional dependency makes slaves out of us, especially if this is a dependency of our self-esteem. If you need encouragement, if you need praises, pats on the back from everybody, then you turn everybody into your judge. You turn everybody into your parent.
There wasn't a chance of making the outgoing love of St. Francis a workable and joyous way of life until these fatal and almost absolute dependencies were cut away. Because I had over the years undergone a little spiritual development, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies had never before been so starkly revealed. Reinforced by what grace I could secure in prayer, I found I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people, upon AA, indeed upon any act or circumstance whatsoever. Then could I be free to love as Francis did. Emotional and instinctual satisfactions I saw were really the extra dividends of having love, offering love, and expressing love appropriate to each relation of life.
Well, this is a very important segment in this letter. So first of all, this idea that we lack will and that will is lack of will is our problem is really not true. I mean, we're incredibly willful people, and we just need to learn it to use it in our best interest. And he talks about it here is that we really need to make a commitment to cleaning this up. If we're going to achieve emotional sobriety, we have to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies. Now, you can understand it about people, but then when he says upon AA, a lot of people go, well, wait, what is he talking about? I mean, didn't we replace one unhealthy dependence, our dependence on alcohol, with a healthy dependency on AA? No, AA does not promote dependency. It's to help you learn how to stand on your own 2 feet and take care of you. That's what Bill realized. You know, we could take the dirty shoe off one foot and put it on the other. And that's not what we want to do. We don't want to now become dependent on AA. Oh, yeah, we want to have a healthy relationship with AA, a humble relationship with AA where we learn and we grow ourselves. But it does not promote dependency. AA is about learning to have true independence of spirit, is what Bill called it. And he realized that he could go to the meetings and look at the meetings and what was going on in the meetings for the wrong reason. Not to grow himself, but to get this other validated sense of self. And now look, this is the founder of the program. You can imagine what it was like when he walked into a meeting. Right, the kind of accolades and acknowledgement that he received, and this was a pitfall. It was a hazard for him to go with that. And then he talked about if we let go of this dependency, then we can be free to love, because then I can love you without a price tag. Then we start moving closer to what's called unconditional love, We can have love, offer love, and express love appropriate to each relation of life, which also means that I take away the expectation that I've got to feel the same way about everyone. You see, what we're doing is realizing that you don't have to feel the same way about it. You're going to be closer to some people than others, and you don't need to apologize for that. That's who you are. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I am what I am. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. We got to get to that place in our recovery. So at any moment in our recovery, we can begin the process of growing up and break out of our emotional dependency and start to discover emotional sobriety. And I hope that's what many of you will choose to do after you hear this talk today.
Plainly, I could not avail myself to God's love until I was able to offer it back to Him by loving others as He would have me. And I couldn't possibly do that so long as I was victimized by false dependencies. For my dependencies meant demand, a demand for the possession and control of the people and the conditions surrounding me. While those words absolute dependence may look like a gimmick, they were the ones that helped to trigger my release into my present degree of stability and quietness of mind, qualities which I am now trying to consolidate by offering love to others, regardless of the return to me.
All right, so say this to yourself and see what it feels like. I demand the possession and control of the people and the conditions surrounding me. Now say it to yourself. Say it out loud. Listen to yourself. What happens when you say it? Can you own that? Can you take responsibility for that? See, if you can, then you're beginning your journey in emotional sobriety. That's at the core of our problem. That's what we do. This is putting the cart before the horse. Say, if I can control you, if I can demand that the situation, the people and the conditions around me do what I want them to do, I'm all right. You see, it's all about our expectations. We call these things unenforceable rules. And our emotional dependency generates a ton of these unenforceable rules that we try to enforce, that we impose on other people and on circumstances. So we have this demand that things should be a certain way, that things are supposed to be a certain way for us to be okay. And that's the big lie. That's nonsense. Nothing needs to be a certain way for you to be okay. You need to learn how to deal with what's going on to be okay. That's the heart of emotional sobriety. This is Dr. Jerry Greenwald, and this is the way he says it about relationships. He goes, expectations lead to the erosion of any relationship. The myth that the resolution of loneliness will result because we have found an intimate one-on-one relationship is a cop-out. It begins a toxic process which dissipates the mutual nourishment that occurs when both people are committed to sustaining and nourishing interaction and growth of themselves. I left that part out. That's what expectations do in relationships. They're toxic.
This seems to be the primary healing circuit, an outgoing love of God's creation and His people, by means of which we avail ourselves of His love for us. It's most clear that the real current can't flow until our paralyzing dependencies are broken, and broken at depth. Only then can we possibly have a glimmer of what adult love really is.
The way we define adult love or mature love is union with the preservation of integrity. That's what Erich Fromm called it. I like to think about it as cooperating with integrity. You don't lose yourself in the connection. There's a balance. We go back to the idea of balance that Bill talked about. There's a balance in us between our desire to cooperate, to connect, to join, and our individuality and honoring our individuality in a relationship. So we cooperate with integrity.
If we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependence and its consequent demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may then be able to gain emotional sobriety.
So here's the heart of the matter in terms of how do we unhook ourselves from these expectations? Well, we have to really take a look at ourselves when we get upset. And instead of looking at what the other person is doing and diagnosing them or interpreting their behavior, if you're upset, it means something is amiss with you, not with them. He says, if you look at that, you're going to find at the root of your emotional disturbance, your unhealthy dependence and the consequent demand and unenforceable rules. When we surrender these things based on our humility, I have no business putting my demands on you on how you're supposed to be. That's not right for me to do that. That's disrespectful of you, and that's disrespectful of me. It says I need you to be a certain way to be okay, and that I'm going to demand that you do what I think you should do. That disrespects you. There's no room for you. There's no room for me in that kind of an idea. If I can surrender these things, then I can be set free to really love you. I can be set free to learn how to start to deal with life and to gain emotional sobriety.
Of course, I haven't offered you a really new idea, only a gimmick that has started to unhook several of my own hexes at depth. Nowadays, my brain no longer races compulsively in either elation, grandiosity, or depression. I've been given a quiet place in bright sunshine.
Wow. Unhook. Great image. That's such a helpful image for you to think about this when you're trying to unhook people from your expectations, from your unenforceable rules. Now let's go back to it's better to comfort than to be comforted, right? And so we're told all the time in the program, if you're in a bad place, go help somebody else. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. But now think of it in terms of what we've been talking about. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. It's better for me to learn how to comfort myself rather than depend on you to be comforted. It's better to comfort it than it's better to comfort than to be comforted. So that's a whole different way of starting to look at the St. Francis prayer. So the quest for greater awareness of ourselves and our world is a healthy approach to living, and it allows us to achieve this emotional sobriety that we're talking about here this morning. And what is emotional sobriety? Well, it creates this emotional freedom, which results in what Bill called a true independence of spirit. So with that, let us stop here.
Thank you so much, Alan. I really appreciate it. Thank you.